LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom.
And I'm Panio Gianopoulos.
And this is The Next Big Idea.
Today, the wisdom and wonder of being uncertain.
Panio, I think it may make sense to share with listeners up front that your guest today, Maggie Jackson, has a special distinction. Her new book, Uncertain, was one of two selected for this season of the Next Big Idea Club. Now, there are probably folks listening who don't really know what that means, what our process is and how it works. Do you want to share?
Let me take you into the kitchen. I'll show you how the dishes are made. All right. So there are 3 steps. First, I scout hundreds of upcoming nonfiction books, and from among those, I pick the top 20 to 30 that I think merit special attention. So these are our monthly must-reads.
And I think it's worth noting that the publishers and editors and publicists and authors campaign to have their books recognized. Like this is a pretty big deal.
They do. In fact, the people at the post office know me very well by name because every day I go and I get stacks and stacks of packages.
Yeah, they're all campaigning for this distinction. And then what happens?
Well, then, every 3 months, our curators choose 8 finalists from among those must-reads.
And by the way, our curators, for those who haven't been paying close attention, are Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink.
Right. Heavy hitters. So I've scouted hundreds of books. The curators have narrowed it down to a list of 8, and then they vote on their top 2.
This, by the way, is not an easy process. There's a lot of back and forth.
A lot of discussion, a lot of reading, a lot of emails. So finally, we send those 2 winning books to our box subscribers, along with a handy-dandy reading guide and the link to an original audio e-course written and recorded by the authors.
We've been doing this for 23 seasons. Can you believe that, Panio?
No. In fact, I think when we started, I still had black hair, and now I look like Anderson Cooper on a bad day.
You and me both. So season 23 just shipped, and it features Maggie's book. And Panio, you had the pleasure of interviewing Maggie Jackson. Tell us a little bit about who she is and what her book is about.
Sure. So Maggie Jackson is an award-winning author and journalist. She's known for her groundbreaking work on social trends, especially how technology impacts our lives.
And I think she made a name for herself with her earlier book, Distracted. Is that right?
Yeah. Distracted sparked a global conversation about the costs of fragmented attention. And what's really amazing is that it came out way back in 2009. She was really ahead of the curve. I mean, that's before Instagram was even around. She's got a new book out now. It's called Uncertain. And as the title suggests, it's about the benefits of being unsure. And you know what? I think it's going to spark another global conversation. It's already been nominated for a National Book Award.
Wow. I'm not buttering you up here, Panio.
Feel free to butter me up, actually. Just go for it.
All right, I am buttering you up. I found the conversation we're about to share with listeners to be riveting. And just to set this up, why should we care about uncertainty?
Because we think and perform better when we're uncertain.
Which is counterintuitive, isn't it? Because many of us associate uncertainty with fear, anxiety, paralysis, even weakness, I think.
Right. Fear shuts us down, literally. It siphons blood from our brains. But if we can recast that fear as uncertainty, and Maggie has tips for how to do that, we can turn it into a superpower. It's called approach mode. Actually, Maggie calls it wakefulness, and it boosts things like creativity, persuasion, and leadership.
One example that I love is that executives who hedge what they say with words and phrases like maybe and sometimes and I don't know are perceived as having better judgment.
Yeah, that's according to studies coming out of Harvard and other places that show weak or tentative or, quote, uncertain language can give you a leadership edge.
So interesting. Well, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll hear your conversation with Maggie.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
Maggie, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
So you're an acclaimed author and journalist. You're known for your insightful explorations of contemporary issues affecting society and, of course, on the individual level. Your new book, Uncertain, The Wisdom and Wonder of Being Unsure, explores the transformative potential of embracing uncertainty in various aspects of life. So what inspired you to tackle this topic?
Well, I actually kind of backed into it. After my book, Distracted, which is about the erosion of attention in society, I wanted to write a companion book on thinking. What kinds of thinking do we need in the digital age, and what's under siege, and what are we gaining? And the first chapter was about uncertainty. And so I fell into this sort of rabbit hole in which I discovered that not only there was a tremendous amount of research, new research on uncertainty, which had been a topic that was pushed under the rug, even in psychology, in our outcome-oriented world. And then secondly, I discovered that many of my own, and I think popular assumptions about uncertainty were just plain wrong. So that just, it wouldn't let me go. I found myself thinking and talking about it, and I wrote a couple more chapters of the old book, but then it turned. I pivoted, and I was really glad to delve into it further.
The book, which is wonderfully written, by the way. It's always nice when a lot of times I find that nonfiction can have some really fascinating insights and research, but then the writing itself is just not pedestrian, because that's pejorative, but it's just sort of matter of fact. But you have really beautiful flourishes in here, and it's a wonderfully written book. So within these very elegant and lyrical passages, there are startling and surprising moments. For example, you mention pretty early on in the book that years of experience are often weakly or even negatively correlated with accuracy and skill. And you talk about fields from chess to finance. That seems so counter to everything we learn. We learn about mastery being about fluency and familiarity, and you do your 10,000 hours, the Malcolm Gladwell quote, and then suddenly you're just amazing and you don't even have to think, right? It's automaticity. Apparently that's wrong.
Yes, well, the fluency and facility that you mentioned that are accrued through practice and experience are really an important stage of expertise. When we become expert, we gain mental models and heuristic shortcuts. So the doctor hears chest pains and thinks heart attack. That's why the expert can walk into the room and know just what to do and how to diagnose the problem. And that's, they're the people we trust to jump to conclusions. But it's actually been pretty recently discovered that there's another whole level of expertise beyond that. It had to do with these complicated reasons on how they studied expertise previously. But, routine experts are really impressive in familiar environments because the first thought that comes to our mind is actually usually based on the past. It's what's worked in the past. That's how we can sail through familiar environments. But once the expert is faced with this new, murky, sudden problem, then they are typically over time entrenched in their old solutions, in those old heuristic shortcuts. And so that's when they begin to suffer from what's called creeping intuition bias. And so what does it have to do with uncertainty? Well, the real true expert, superior expert, is called adaptive, and they're the ones who can inhabit the question, the new complex question. They actually spend more time diagnosing a new problem than even novices do, again, across disciplines, this is found. And so they are the ones who are skeptical even in routine, and they take on harder cases, and they're really just harnessing that time of uncertainty and then moving forward in that way.
That's interesting. I think there's maybe a strange parallel, but it reminds me a little of the idea that to become a great artist, you need to learn the rules and then you can break the rules, right? So the first step maybe is you learn all these rules and you get this pattern recognition down, but that really does limit sort of how far you're going to go.
Exactly. And the key is to recognize when you're in a new situation, don't back out of that uncertainty, because the other pillar of uncertainty is a space of possibilities, but it's also a signal. It's basically a signal to ourselves neurologically, physiologically. When you're uncertain and you're uneasy, that's a good stress response. And so that is what ushers you in away from autopilot and into that incredibly, creative or deliberative or intentional exploration of this unknown that you're facing, the problem in the operating room or, the anomaly in the books if you're an accountant and that kind of thing. When you think about uncertainty as your ally, as a knowledgeable expert, as a leader, it changes our ideal of what leadership or expertise can be. Rather than the all-knowing person who's handing down the answer, which is something we've all in our society been kind of critiquing or jostling up against or rebelling against. Instead, they become the partner in care or the partner to the solution. They start to listen to what the problem wants to tell them, not their assumptions. It's a game changer.
And so you talk about there are two types of uncertainty, right? There's one involving life's unpredictability, right? And then another is our own psychological unsureness. Do I get that right?
Yes, it's nice that there are two major kinds of uncertainty, not 36. But
Right.
The aleatory uncertainty is the unknown. So we see that, in the headlines, uncertainty roils the stock market, et cetera. And so often people use probabilistic reasoning or et cetera to kind of get a toehold on likelihood or assess the risk analysis. But then there's epistemic, our psychological uncertainty, and that's the human response to the unknown. That's what happens, how you respond to what's new and murky. You hit a traffic jam, you're on your way to a meeting, you don't know if you're going to get there. You don't know if the app is going to choose the right route. You could be this way, it could be that way. That's uncertainty. It's not ignorance because you're operating under some type of level of knowledge. You're caught short, but then you're also faced with multiple possibilities. That's where uncertainty begins to be a real opportunity.
Right. And flipping this on its head seems challenging because I think a lot of us associate uncertainty with, if not ignorance, then maybe paralysis. It doesn't inspire confidence in me if I say, hey, what should we do? And they're like, gosh, I don't know, I'm uncertain. Well, I think, all right, well, okay, great. I mean, that's not the idea of a leader or a partner that you want to get with. You want someone who says, well, let's do this because this makes sense for this reason. How do we change this perception of uncertainty? In a way, how do we rebrand uncertainty so it's a strength rather than a weakness?
Yes, and I think that it's really important because that misunderstanding, the colossal misunderstanding that we have about uncertainty as synonymous with weakness and inertia comes from so many different influences. I mean, first of all, we do live and have for hundreds of years in a kind of outcome-oriented, efficiency-oriented culture. It focuses more on the goal and the result than on the process. And so that's one reason why uncertainty has been little studied scientifically until very recently. At the same time, that unease that I talked about, is actually a good stress response that's a signal that uncertainty is giving you that it's time to update your understanding of the world rather than continue on to autopilot. That's also seen as a uncomfortable state that we should eradicate as quickly as possible or retreat from. In the acute phase of the pandemic, people who were tolerant of uncertainty, they were more accepting of the realities of the situation. And a lot follows from that implication. Whereas people who were intolerant, who really see uncertainty as a threat, they responded to the pandemic with denial, avoidance, and substance abuse. Studies show that the fear of uncertainty is what holds us back, not uncertainty itself. When you can understand that arousal or wakefulness is not negative, then you're averting the fear. And fear is a shutting down, fear of the unknown, fear of whatever your boss is thinking during your presentation. Fear is shutting you down physiologically and neurally. It literally siphons blood away from your extremities, including the brain. Whereas uncertainty is an opening up. It's called approach mode or arousal. I call it wakefulness. So there are a lot of misunderstandings about this state that we can now begin to back up. And then it becomes a matter of how do we utilize it as a strength? Well, strategically, productively, skillfully. I mean, that's what a lot of my research is about, trying to harness uncertainty in these productive ways. And the other point that's really important is uncertainty. We don't want to live in uncertainty. That's nobody's definition of the good life. Limbo is not the end goal. But when you're in a new situation, utilizing or harnessing your uncertainty is absolutely synonymous with better performance in crises, in collaboration. I mean, even when it comes to just the daydream, the creative daydream, I think that there are ways we can begin to understand uncertainty rather than run from it.
It's not completely surprising to me that uncertainty plays a big role in creativity, because creativity is a messy, stumbling process. But when it comes to other aspects of, say, professional life, this is where I was really startled. For example, you talk about how uncertainty can make someone more persuasive, which when I first heard, I frankly didn't believe. I thought, what's less persuasive than someone who's full of doubts? So how does that work?
First of all, it's more persuasive for experts to express uncertainty. So if you're a rank beginner, you're the intern in the office, and you're always saying, I don't know, that probably isn't going to gain you credibility. But if you're the leader, the manager, an expert, a doctor, etc., then actually expressions of uncertainty are persuasive because they indicate that you're receptive to others' viewpoints, opening up the conversation. It also indicates that there's something more to know. It's a signal. It's a linguistic signal. And I'm particularly talking about words like I don't know, but also maybe or sometimes. There's studies out of Harvard that show that executives who are using those kind of hedge words and also were good listeners were seen as better professionals and having better judgment than other executives who use words like therefore and you're wrong. The other thing is that people who are tolerant of uncertainty or harnessing uncertainty do things like arguing to learn rather than arguing to win. You can see the, correlation with the words I was just talking about. So people who argue to learn, actually during pauses in a conversation, they actually mention the fact that they might not know, or they, again, use these cues that they're open. Whereas people who argue to win in pauses, they wade in and try to end the conversation and taunt the others. And so, wow, what would be more persuasive?
That's very funny. I can think of some personal examples in my life. I imagine that there is quite a range of a kind of inherent familiarity and comfort with uncertainty, right? Different psychological profiles. Some people find uncertainty terrifying, some people find it okay, and some people maybe even embrace it. How can individuals, on a practical level, how can we improve our personal tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, especially if it makes us very anxious?
Well, it's a little bit like a riff off exposure therapy. So rather than being exposed to the plastic spider and then the real one, you're actually exposing yourself a little more to the unknown. So you might delegate more at work, or you might try a new dish in a restaurant. And it sounds in some ways really innocuous, but actually these little tiny steps spill over into the rest of our lives. So you're actually becoming surprised by uncertainty, because a lot of people think of uncertainty as disastrous or as a form of inertia. But then what happens when you delegate and cede control a little bit to the intern or whoever, the junior person in the office, you're discovering that it's not necessarily going to be always disastrous. It's not necessarily always going to be a perfect, success story either. You're discovering that multiplicity of opportunities within something that's uncertain. And that's really important. You're actually using prediction error or the surprise that is the best way for your brain to learn. Your brain learns best on uncertainty and surprise, and you're using that with your own view of the world. I took up open water 4-season swimming in Rhode Island, where I moved to during the pandemic. And after a long time being a person who doesn't like high waves, who really actually does not like the cold. I mean, I'm out there in 6-foot waves doing laps and in January weather, et cetera. And I discovered it's not just the camaraderie, it's not just the exercise, but it's my daily dose of uncertainty. And it truly has strengthened me in ways that spill over into the rest of my life.
That's so fascinating. And it's funny, it would take a word like uncertainty and you pull it out of context. It ends up being this sort of very disembodied kind of philosophical thing. But as you describe, it really is attached to things like learning, engagement, developmental risk. Whereas if you go towards just, I'm only going to do what I know, I'm only going to do what I'm familiar with, I mean, you're shutting down, you're kind of closing yourself off.
It's really interesting too, because I've been seeing more studies, but it was sort of a percolating subtext in my whole research for the book, is that the brain is more active when we're uncertain. That occurs when you're in an argument. The brain is far more active. It pulls in a lot more regions of the brain when you're arguing. In between movements in a symphony, the silences are associated with more activity, brain activity, than the actual listening to the music, because you're at the edge of what you're knowing and trying to understand. I mean, again and again, the uncertainty is where we're most active. And that also just flies in the face of our stereotype understanding of doing nothing, because action only seems to be speedy and physical and goal-oriented, but action can be something very much within and because of uncertainty. I really think of it as wisdom in motion, as a very, very dynamic state of mind.
That's a nice phrase. And it seems to me that it's, as you said, dynamic. It's a kind of dance, right? You're dipping in and out of uncertainty. You're getting new data, new experiences, integrating them. So you're not just constantly stumbling uncertainly and unknowingly through life. You're kind of going out like a little kid, when they're with their parent, they go out, and then they rush back, going out, coming back.
I think that we can sort of dismantle, as a result of all this incredible new science, the idea that certainty is the goal. I mean, resolution, stability is what the human will always want. But at the same time, certainty is something that holds us back in every way, shape, and form. So to understand that the world is dynamic and unpredictable is incredibly important. So one of the ways in which we can not go down the road of anxiety in a high stakes moment, but we can go into this approach mode and get on our toes and heed uncertainty, is simply by expecting that the world will change. I mean, we all know that deer in the headlights kind of moment, when you try to assess how it's going, even in the middle of how it's going. And that's natural. But at the same time, if we can remain present to the uncertainty and the possibilities within, then we're a lot better off. I mean, understanding uncertainty actually made me understand mindfulness for the first time.
How so?
Because I always wondered, well, present orientation is important, but I always was very much a fan of future orientation, plan, and how's it going, and, et cetera. And I sort of didn't really quite understand how deeply critical it is to be present oriented, especially when you are in these high stakes situations. And so to understand that the discomfort and the unease, the good stress of uncertainty is our way of rising to the occasion is really liberating. And that's also a word that I find many, many people tell me when they hear about this, they use that word again and again and again. It's liberating because they don't have to face the future or the moment with fear and with anxiety. They're facing it with wonder and curiosity and openness to what is. It really makes life a lot more fun.
Sure. It's a fundamental perspective shift, right? You're approaching the unknown or the future or the near future, right? With a sense of openness, I suppose, right? And saying like, we don't know what's going to happen. Just because things have happened in the past, it does not accurately predict what's to come. It doesn't mean I need to be scared. It just means I need to be aware of what's happening.
Yes. And I think also, to put it another way, I mentioned autopilot, and we all know it. We zone out on the commute home. We know just how to tie our shoelaces or how to take a shower. I mean, we live in this zone of familiarity, and that's how we sail through life. It's called predictive processing. We all use mental models of how language works or what it's like to do a Zoom call, et cetera, in order to just basically move through life seamlessly. And therefore, we don't have to rethink everything. But at the same time, another way to describe uncertainty is by calling it the prediction error. So when you meet that something new, you innately, unconsciously register an error. It actually creates these brain waves. It's really quite an amazing, and basically it's a reality check. So uncertainty is a reality check for you, when to move out of that familiar space. And again, what could be more exciting? And there was an Australian philosopher who did studies of the metaphors related to uncertainty, which I really love, Michael Smithson. And he found that people, this is just the popular associations with uncertainty are lostness, darkness, wandering, but also exploration. And I'm trying to remember the others, but you could see the flavor of being on the edge, not quite being in control, being in the unfamiliar. And I think that encapsulates it really well.
Well, not to sound like a romantic, but uncertainty is at the heart of falling in love, right? You meet someone and say there's a flirtation or a connection, and you think, and I mention this, it's very top of mind because my daughter, who's 20, is very often sending me texts of like, oh, I really like this guy. What does this text mean? Or what do you think of this? What of that? It's very sweet that she asks get my take. And I see her wild emotional swings from one day to the next where, oh, this guy's great, or I don't like him anymore, or does he like me? I don't like him, or he doesn't like. But it's a rush too, right? You're so present. And in those moments, I look at her with a certain kind of envy because I think, wow, I mean, every single minute counts right now. When you're waiting for someone to text you back, when you're waiting, are we going to do this? Are we going to go to the movie? Or whatever we're going to do? You're so present. You're so invested. You're like thrumming with possibility. And that's exciting, right? That's you couldn't be more present in your life. Whereas, as you get older, and like you said, you automate a lot of things, all these heuristics and mental models, you sort of optimize your life to minimize these moments of both pleasure and pain. Right, that's the downside. That's kind of the robotic side of us, right? Like how much can we put the guardrails on and just make it like easy? But at a certain point, you can sort of automate away the excitement and the fun.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really true. Your daughter in those moments, or when people are falling in love, they feel really alive. And isn't that's the most uncertain thing there can be. And in fact, there are studies that show that people are more attractive if they are more or less certain about you. If I, like a certain guy and he's not certain about me, it makes him more attractive, which is the stuff of much great literature, right?
Sure. I mean, everybody knows that experience for good and for bad.
Yeah. And
wow,
and then uncertainty.
She doesn't like me? Huh. That's exciting.
Yeah, I know, exactly. It makes them more, we could go on and on about that. But uncertainty also is a moment of suspense. It's actually a temporal state. Just pausing after learning new material or having a new experience boosts your memory by 20% for that material. So literally doing nothing is a kind of protective quiet time to allow your brain to digest that information through a process called replay. Your brain actually runs over at 7 to 21 times normal speed what's happening. They discovered this by little sleeping mice who were running through the maze that they had just learned. It's really totally cool. But that's a moment of suspense. You are giving your mind the opportunity to digest experience. And it's not just to encode the memory, but also your hippocampus is cross-referencing by time, space, situation, context. It's readying that information to be assimilated into these branching knowledge networks that we have. We don't have just piles of random data fluffing in, although it might feel it on certain days, but we have these wonderful associational networks. And so your brain is going to assimilate that information by context so that you can have open-ended learning. So that's really at the core, putting time on our side. That's the suspense of uncertainty. So uncertainty, I call uncertainty, and many of the experts and scientists and roboticists that I interviewed just coincidentally use that exact same term. Uncertainty is a space of possibilities, but it's also there's a temporal, benefit to it.
It's possible, it occurs to me, that my conversation with Panio at the top about how the Next Big Idea Club works piqued your interest. Would you like to get the best books of the year delivered to your door and then discuss them with the authors and our team here? Go to nextbigideaclub.com and use promo code podcast for 20% off. That's nextbigideaclub.com, promo code podcast.
Let's widen the lens a little and approach it from a macro societal look, right? So do you think societal attitudes towards uncertainty have evolved in recent years or decades, especially with the rise of, digital technology and social media?
There is some evidence that people are seeing uncertainty more as a threat. Those are studies with young people, and it's coming in parallel with technology. I mean, more work needs to be done, but there's a hint there that people are growing. And Sorry, I just want to follow that really quickly, because it would seem, again, I have no data. This is all anecdotal, but it would seem that the way that we curate our news feeds through social media would reduce the number of surprising or conflicting reports, right? So I might disagree with something either politically or socially, and I just don't see it anymore, right? So all I see is confirmation of this is how I feel, this is how my friends feel, whereas I don't have to integrate these sort of opposing ideas. And that would that might mean to much less tolerance for uncertainty, because I just don't see it as much anymore. Yeah, no, I think that's very much part of the influences on our attitudes toward uncertainty very much. I mean, there's a outcome-oriented, efficiency-oriented, bottom-line attitude approach to life and what success is and what it means to know. But technology has also offered us ways to remain in these echo chambers. The studies do show that to be the case, not always, but that, very much there is a lot of funneling us toward what is essentially unsurprising. So if you think about it, as one neuroscientist told me, no surprise, no learning. Understanding of what we don't know is how we move forward, how we learn, etc. And so I think that to retreat now into certainties is precisely the mistake that we shouldn't make in a time of flux, because there are measures and a lot of evidence that there's growing volatility in job hours. There's growing precarity for many people. There's more uncertainty in geopolitics, et cetera. At this moment, the worst thing we can do is meet all of that volatility with certainty, shut down the exploration, shut down the creativity. What we really need to do is, ironically and seemingly surprisingly, be more able to harness our uncertainty in order to be kind of nimble. I almost think of it as surfing the unknown. When you are uncertain, you're open, you're bendable, you're curious, you're skeptical. It's just a much more, and it's a healthier way to be. It's also a more successful way to be.
How is it more successful? Are there studies that show a corresponding increase in, professional success with a certain psychological template? Tolerance?
Well, that's interesting. I don't know about that, but the studies there's increasing interest in tolerance of uncertainty as well. It's been proven that it's related to over-testing, over-diagnosis, anxiety, and burnout in doctors. So that's something that people are really trying to develop interventions for. There's a lot of more interest in the business world. One big study, gold standard, award-winning study of CEOs found that in the middle of a long-term crisis, the ambivalent CEOs were more inclusive and more resourceful. So there's a lot of, I think it both understanding uncertainty both changes what it means to be successful and opens up this whole frontier of not knowing. And at the same time, it also, just does get us not just any answer, but it gains us the better answer. And all of this can be done in a very short minutes. It's not as if uncertainty is something you need to, go to a monastery for a year to incorporate into your life.
Did you find, after all the research you did and the writing of the book, did you find that there was a certain technique or a strategy or an approach to handling uncertainty that really resonated with you? Something that you give, that you suggest to people? Like a quick, oh, here's what I do.
Well, I think there are so many. Cue words are really useful. Perspective taking is sort of easy and folk wisdom, but it's amazing. I think that pausing, after that changed how I work. I used to sort of stack meetings or the more packed my schedule was, the better I felt, the more I was getting done. And now I pause after reading a difficult scientific paper or having an interview with someone. I pause. I don't even run through the notes. I might do that later. But that pausing has really made the day less of a blur for me. So I think that's helpful. There's just so many. And also by pausing, experience that is familiar and consistent with what you already know is easier to remember, whereas anything that contradicts what we know, and goes against our confirmation bias actually takes longer time for the brain to curate and to assimilate into your knowledge networks. This is something that Darwin knew really well. And so it occurs to me that maybe by pausing, letting our minds digest experience, including opinions and perspectives that are different or counter to our own, then we can become less echo chambery. We can become a little bit less ossified, or I don't know what the word is, but anyhow, we can become far more open-minded if we just pause.
I'm pausing right now as I think about that.
Good job.
I'm a natural at this.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
Hi, I'm Kwame Christian, CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, and I have a quick question for you. When was the last time you had a difficult conversation? These conversations happen all the time, and that's exactly why you should listen to Negotiate Anything, the #1 negotiation podcast in the world. We produce episodes every single day to help you lead, persuade, and resolve conflicts both at work and at home. So level up your negotiation skills by making Negotiate Anything part of your daily routine.
As a final question, I'm curious, you started your career writing a book about distractedness.
The first book was about the nature of home. Yeah, a little
forgotten.
forgotten.
Right. That's right.
Nature
the nature
of
of
home.
home. And then you did distractedness, and now you did uncertainty. So it's a trilogy. Do you find that the idea for the next book arises when you're finishing the previous book?
Yes, I find that even though this one I backed into it and I thought I was writing a book about thinking when I was writing a book about uncertainty, but at the same time, it really did, it was a sequel to the distracted book, because when you have a moment's focus, what do you do with it? And then I realized that uncertainty is the missing pillar of good thinking in our society today. And I looking back on the distracted book, I really did start to talk more about reflection and these, slower types of thinking and just wading into the unknown. I didn't really realize it. So it's not as if it's an easy jump, a stepping stone to stepping stone. I possibly could go in multiple other directions. From Distracted, I could have written many other different books, but this seemed to be the most, because the theme in the trilogy, which I didn't really even realize until I finished this book, was that I write about aspects of humanity that are very often misunderstood and usually right under our noses, and yet we could barely explain them to one another on the street. The nature of attention, what is home, and also now uncertainty. So the murkiest, muddiest, but most right up front issues, I would say, in our lives.
Well, as a reader of so much nonfiction, which is a lot of what I do at the Next Big Idea Club, is just read nonfiction after nonfiction. I will say it's an exciting time to be a reader because, like you said, a lot of these things which are right under our noses are finally being explored scientifically. And then there are wonderful writers like you who are putting together these arguments and these explorations in really intriguing ways. Whereas it seems like for a long time, so much of science was about actually very goal-oriented, right? It was about trying to prove or firm up the evidence that we are very rational, right? We're very rational. We do this. We're these mechanistic beings. And then, you see it over the years, with behavioral economics. Well, maybe we're not rational actors, even in financial and, situations or professional situations. And then you see, book after book, research paper after research paper, which is we are messy, we are contradictory, we are full of anxieties and uncertainties. And but there is a real strength in this, and pretending otherwise doesn't help.
Right. That's so well said. Exactly. And I think that for so long, humans have kind of hidden behind certainties in a certain way, or accepted them, assumed them to be true, such as the brain is set in stone until adulthood, or the stars are fixed in the sky, going back even further. And now, ironically, these certainties are crumbling. And so that opens up, as Daniel Boorstin said, this is an age of questions, not answers. That opens up all of human learning. And yet in this particular time period, right now, we are, I think, at this crossroads moment when it's really easy to retreat into certainties, hating one another, or assuming something about how things will go politically or even economically. All of that is we're poised to either move into these great unknowns and explore and equip ourselves, or retreat in a way that would be such a lost opportunity. And so I think I see that's I see this as a pretty seismic moment when it comes to humanity's relationship with uncertainty.
I agree. And Uncertain, the Wisdom and Wonder of Being Unsure is your handbook for this seismic moment. Maggie, thank you so much for joining me and talking to me about your book. It was fascinating to get behind the scenes.
Well, thank you. It was really a great conversation. I learned a lot, too.
Panio, I love this quote from Daniel Boorstin. This is an age of questions, not answers. I'm curious, have you in your own life been guilty of too much certainty prior to this conversation?
When I was in my 20s, definitely. Which is ironic because I barely knew anything then. Now that I'm in my 40s, I'm embracing my uncertainty. Maggie's book helped with that.
Isn't it amazing how these books impact our lives? I mean, I've certainly been affected by each of these books that I read. Well, there's also the political context. As Maggie says at the end there, this is a seismic moment when it comes to humanity's relationship with uncertainty. Powerful words. We'll have to do our part. At a minimum, I think I'm equal to the challenge of increasing the frequency of my maybes sometimes and the occasional I don't know.
Yeah, and it works on both sides. Demonstrating uncertainty and also allowing for other people to demonstrate more uncertainty. It's very liberating.
All right, folks. Question for listeners. Do you have a story about uncertainty in your own life? If you're one of the first 5 people to share your story about uncertainty, we'll give you a free 1-year digital membership to the Next Big Idea Club. Just search for me, Rufus Griscom, on LinkedIn and comment under my post about this conversation. Maggie Jackson's new book, Uncertain, The Wisdom and Wonder of Being Unsure, is out now. Pick up a copy wherever books are sold. Or better yet, become a Next Big Idea Club executive member, and we'll send a copy to your door along with a reading guide, invitations to member-only Q&As with Maggie, a beautiful audio e-course based on the book, and more. Visit nextbigideaclub.com to learn more. And if you do decide to subscribe, the code PODCAST gets you 20% off. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger, sound design by Mike Toda. The Next Big Idea is a proud member of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Rufus Griscom.
And I'm Panio Gianopoulos.
See you next week.